Hi. So let's talk about taking notes in a math class, just some things for you to think about. And I know plenty of you have already taken classes or sessions on taking notes and might even be doing one in this Viking summer voyage. But I want to talk about some specific things for math. To begin, let's ask a couple questions of you. For example, how do you take notes? Well, I've got some guiding questions. If you already know the material that the instructor wrote down, do you still put it in your notes? I've had some students tell me they don't write it down because they already know it. But I have to believe that seeing a solid picture of everything that's being covered all together might be helpful. If it's working for you, you can try to stick with it. But sometimes you hit that class where what used to work doesn't always still work. What about when the instructor writes out something that doesn't make sense or you don't understand it? Do you still write it down anyways? I had a student once tell me he only takes notes on the stuff he knows, but I'm not sure how he's supposed to learn the new material. And even if it's confusing, at least it gives you a reference to go back and ask the professor or someone else in the class. So maybe it'll even make sense later. I'd suggest you write it down. Do you write down everything that the professor writes on the board? Okay, well maybe it feels like we just addressed that above, what you know and you don't know. But I'm talking about more than that. What about if the instructor writes, here are the 3 topics we're going to cover today? Or here's a graph to help explain what I just said. Sometimes it's those little extra things that can really make a difference. And what about, do you write down the things the professor says but does not write down? This was huge for me. I don't think I started doing this until like my 3rd or 4th year in college, and it made such a difference. Yeah, sometimes the professor would say, this is going to be on the test, and I'd put a star next to it. But I'm talking about when they would say something like, oh, and this ties back to the Pythagorean theorem, or you're going to use this again later when we do hypothesis testing. So even though I didn't have any clue what they were talking about, I'd write it down, and then later when I reviewed my notes, sometimes not even until the final exam, suddenly it made sense, and it also helped me understand the material at a deeper level. So what is the point of taking notes? I mean, it's to get information, but there's a little more to that. You want to learn what the professor feels is important in each section. Perhaps they're not covering a topic because they're not going to ask you about it. Perhaps they're spending a lot more time on one topic than another, and when you realize you have 3 pages of notes on one section, but only 1 page on a different section, it lets you know what's probably going to be on the test. Also, this is your way to see what the professor does for solving a problem. Like, what level of detail do they expect you to include on a test? Is there a certain format they want you to write your work out? Are there steps that you have to show or you won't get full credit? Obviously, it's another way of understanding new material, to be able to read over it until it makes sense to you, and to have an outline for the material you're going to study for the exam. So this way, you know your exam's on Chapter 2. As you keep reviewing your Chapter 2 notes, you kind of start to see the theme. And lastly, it's to help you solve your homework problems. For some people, that's all they need to do to study a test, is just work out the problems. But what about when you're stuck? What if your instructor did one just like it? It's so helpful to see what progression needs to take place. So here are some ideas for improving your note-taking skills. Show your professor the notes you took and ask that person if you're missing any important information. You might have felt you wrote everything down, and maybe you did, but the professor didn't write out a couple things that they're expecting you to write. This is a great opportunity to find out about that. Also, if possible, ask to see a friend's notes. This one was a big one for me too. Like, I felt it took too much time to use different colored pens, and I had a friend who actually just used a pen and a pencil, and she would always write down definitions in pen, but everything else in pencil. It made the definitions stand out so much more clearly for me that it's something I started doing. And here's another one that might help you. After you get your first exam back, compare the questions on the test and the work as to how you were graded to your class notes. Were you skipping steps that you got points taken off on the exam? Maybe for this instructor you do need to write more detail. Or were you getting problems wrong because you thought it was one type versus another and you weren't writing the directions for for the problems on your notes. Something to consider to start doing.